Welcome, everyone. Dr. Thor here. Get ready for Christ consciousness. Well, finally getting to end of the trilogy by Lieutenant Colonel Col Aquino, The Temple of Set. His three books, Mind War, Mind Star, and FINDFAR. This is the FINDFAR review. And as usual, this is a lumped together, giant, boring mess. It's interesting that he considers this a philosophy, but I'm not really surprised. I mean, the problem with all these people that are into weird and odd stuff, it's amazing. Of course, he's a test passer. Let's remember that. From the Cub Scouts to Eagle Scouts, where he got his little badges, so he knew how to play the game to pass tests. But as an intellectual person, he is really not there at all. He's had a weird way of getting into the military. He didn't go through really what you would call officer candidate school. He went through a regular college that had this as an additional class, and then he was able to get into the become an officer non-traditionally, which of course is a smart way to go, so you don't have to go through a lot of that nonsensical training they give you, where they stress you out and scream in your face and everything else, supposedly. But as usual, his books are full of a worthless nonsense. There is some interesting things here. Let's talk about this book generally. To start off with, to give you an idea, this book is dedicated to his first wife, Janet F. Aquino, who apparently died at the age in her 40s, apparently, or late 40s, which we don't know from what or how. There's no mention of that. She shows her tombstone here, which says Forbes. So it's Janet Forbes was her birth name. I'm not sure why she doesn't have her a married name on there or what happened, but he dedicates it to her, which apparently he still has fond memories of. And she's a fairly attractive woman, very typical of these kind of psycho people involved in Satanism. Seems like the women are fairly attractive. Now, as we go through here, he starts, it's just the odd things he puts here. He's got a quote here from it's from The Great Gatsby. And how that even fits in, who knows? Nothing of his books really fit in. They don't make any sense. There are a lot of dribble thrown together. He wants to talk about everything and how he equates life, and he wants to talk about the problems of the world. Then he goes into the problems of the world, and he talks about aging, agricultural AIDS, atomic energy, children, decolonization, Africa. I mean, what does this have to do with anything? He's got this fantasy that his trilogy here is some way going to stop physical war, and that you're going to use psy-oc techniques to stop people from fighting. Couldn't be more of a delusional mindset with someone. It doesn't work like that. That's what he's trying to put negotiations or people trying to stop war at a higher level using certain other techniques, which certainly would be helpful, but this is a recipe for nothing. He just writes such gobbledygook. He goes into all different things: human rights, health, governments, oceans, peace and security, population, terrorism. Who cares? This is just, he's talking about issues of what's happening in the world, like we don't know this is a problem. It's just unbelievably. And then he goes ad nauseum about Machiavelli, and then he talks about, again, he can't get out of Plato, and he talks like you've read all those trash books and have memorized them, where there's some basic virtue there. He talks about logic, deduction, induction, abduction. What is all this stuff? He's teaching about what logic is, and then he assumes you know his trash talk of all these other books he quotes that are really just appropriate for toilet paper. We're looking back, and of course he likes to continually use confusing words and very poorly written, so you don't really get what he's saying. It's just a big, massive mess of nothing here. And really, there's absolutely nothing practical in this book whatsoever. I don't need him to tell me about politics or philosophers or what other people said. It's just, the typical nonsense that you run into. His preface opens with a quote from Outer Limits. He seems to be a fantasist as well. He's constantly referencing films, TV shows, and other things a little bit too much. And he somehow thinks that they're very profound, like a lot of people who got caught up in Star Wars. Well, Star Wars is interesting, but this was based on 1940 serials. And the Star Wars really isn't very profound. It's got some mixed philosophy in it, but it's basically a kid's movie, as Lucas actually said. It's for kids. It was based on 1940 serials, which he grew up to, which I have many of the originals, and they are fun, but they lack a lot. But the 40 serials are much better than Indiana Jones and these other big budget things. They had much more interesting stuff in it. But here he goes to show you the way he writes. In 2013, the strange particle Mind Wars was published. Instead of decaying, however, it has emitted two even stranger particles, Mind Star and now FINDFAR. Altogether, these three particles meld to generate an uber-strange tri-molecule exposure to which resynapses the human brain to regard the existential phenomena of the sentiment humanity in a radically new manifestation. Now, that was read perfectly, actually. What did I just say? It's gobbledygook garbage. This is what's in this guy's head. Now, I found this from pretty much all Temple of Set books. They tend to have no practical information in them, and I don't think they know anything. My conclusion has come up that they don't know anything. This guy has researched what? And if you find something powerful, the reality of the satanic mind is that they're not going to share it. And they're going to put you through, that you have to go through all these layers of leadership to then get there. Because they're not going to want you around. They're not going to give you power. They're not going to give you access. And the people who have become the leaders of the Temple have said, Don Webb, a science fiction writer of mediocre quality and not certainly a great brain, and all the other people who've taken over that we've seen their work. Now a Berkeley teacher has taken it over, which I'm going to look into. I'm not sure what her teaching, but another kind of goofy person who can only survive in Berkeley, where you can get away with that in Dumbademia because they protect these people, no matter how strange they are. So he really thinks that Mind Wars, the first book, is a practical manual for the retirement of traditional physical combat in favor of a mind war. Well, that's what he's trying to say. It's just, and of course that's ridiculous. Like that's ever going to change anything, and people cannot settle things. That's why they go to. You can't agree with somebody. In general, it's going to bring about war if you're able to do it. And what keeps people away from war is the mutual destruction or the fact that you're going to pay a big price. But a lot of people don't even care about that. When you see different wars of late, this is really about destroying your country so you can put a lot of money in your bank. So we have to be very careful with all this. So he goes into all this more dribble-drabble garbage. There's nothing here of value. It's just ridiculous. His quotes and stuff from different people, what he thinks the future is, all that. There really isn't a case. Making his statements on the world and his talking about key issues. Who cares again? What does that have to do with it? He's looking at the bigger picture he's clarifying what's going on in his own mind for his own self. This is certainly not a system. There's not a single practical technique in any of these books. The first book, a little bit, he talks about psyops and how to manipulate people with certain ways of doing things, but it's really not anything of a specific value, some very minor stuff. Certainly this book had absolutely nothing. He's talking about all the problems of the world: food, governance, children, development, democracy, humanitarian assistance, international law, population problems, water, volunteerism. This is what he's writing about. What does that have to do with anything? And it's all thrown in here in these things that don't really cohesive of what is going to happen there. So he goes into a bunch of stuff that is, it's so hard to read this stuff that not skim most. And then he's going to go on endless pages of Machiavelli and his little trickery, which of course is psyops basically. Machiavelli talked about how to manipulate populations, how to do things, talked about the manipulation of political systems. Yeah, we need to have his stuff that was, let's see, when was he born? 1469, just like War of Today, huh, Michael? Are you a colonel? Just like 1467. Unbelievable. So it's just, who cares? This is just garbage. Now, there is one interesting thing here that is kind of mind-blowing. And these are the kind of things he comes up with. And these are the kind of things you want to look for in books like this. If you're going to waste your life reading this terrible garbage, and then you want to try and pick out some gems. Well, here's a very interesting gem. He's going to actually tell you, and he believes this, and now he's been giving out information of a relative sensitive type for years, and it brings me back to the question of, was maybe he was murdered, even though he was dying. Now, again, he was dying from cancer in 2015 or 16? He was diagnosed with cancer, and he stated he almost died from it then, had giant surgeries, etc. But he managed to live another 5 or 6 years before the cancer came back. And then there was no chance of really surviving, and it appears that he took his life to get out of misery and to save misery from a whole bunch of other people by sitting in a hospital bed for months and spending hundreds of thousands of dollars and torturing the people. So the smart way was to actually, this is a time when it's very appropriate to commit. It's not really suicide. You're not going anywhere. Suicide is only when you have opportunities. When you have absolutely no opportunities, when you're physically destroyed and you're in your 70s, well, what is the problem there? So it makes sense that you would be courageous and, time to come to an end. I mean, it makes sense. The body is unable to fix itself. You tried it already. You've had 5 years of non-cancerous growth, and then it comes back. It all makes sense. And this is a fairly common story as well, where it comes back. It's also interesting that it doesn't really make mention of different cures, better healing systems, or anything else. Of course, Satanists can't heal. They're all into negative energy, so they're not going to do any of that, no matter what they say. This is all part of their process of really being detached from the bigger, more important picture. But I'm not going to spend too much time here. But here's exactly, now he did this, he talked about 9/11, and I don't know how many people, I'm going to repeat it here because so much information I give out, you can either miss it or not listen to that, but he stated that 9/11 was a CIA, FBI, Mossad operation. They blew up those buildings from a distance and directly. There. No planes ever hit the buildings. Those were holograms. And of course, there was very little of anything found. Those planes were flown to a military base. They were disassembled and destroyed, and all the passengers were executed. That's what he said in an interview on a radio show. So, which I think is a perfectly logical scenario. So, how much he's in, what does he know about? Well, we don't know again. But he stated this. He stated this a couple of times. Now, he is a lieutenant colonel in the military. Was that something that was not to be reported? I don't know if he has any credibility or not. He's a guy who's accused of child molestation. He's a head of a satanic organization. So what does all that mean? So is that something that upsets them? But you got to remember, the way things are done is that they don't necessarily grab you at that time, but they will go after you even if it's 20 or 30 years. That's how the system works, because they're not going to let you die naturally, so to speak. So I don't know, but he was so sick. Were they afraid of him spouting off more? So the whole idea is, they did this with Rodney King. They murdered him 25 years later. They did this with John Mack, the famous Harvard psychologist and researcher into extraterrestrial. All of a sudden, he was run down on a London street. Really? How often does that happen? With a group of other people, and he was the only one killed. You got to question all these things. It's not coincidental. It's something that seems very fishy. So was he the fact of did they kill him at the very end? They certainly could have. He certainly was shooting his mouth off. But here's the next thing. It's amazing. And of course we want to go into the statement that he believes everything's in the electromagnetic realm and that psychic power does not have any of that. So there is no such thing as psychic power when it's not in the electromagnetic realm. There's no such thing as that. So what there is a unique energy that is placed out there. These are informational energetic fields, and they are not electromagnetic in nature, because the electromagnetic capacities of the human body, even at the highest level, as some people tend to say they are, is still very low. It doesn't have a lot of juice in it like we think. So, and I'm not sure, do you need that? Micro electrical fields have been shown to be very potent and change things. Just zapping something with, 50,000 volts doesn't necessarily make it stronger. Would that carry stronger of these type of energies that we use, these psychoenergetic fields, these bioconsciousness energies? No. When you use strong energies past a level, you start losing it. You're blowing out the actual signal that you're putting into these electromagnetic fields as carrier waves. So he doesn't believe in any of that. He believes all the remote viewing, everything else was failures. He has no belief in psychic powers whatsoever, even though, again, he researched a lot of this, got a bunch of material from the Russians when they were translating that in the 70s and 80s, and pretty much ignores that. Even though he goes in and out of it, he is a person who thinks that they are spirits. Now, are spirits electromagnetic? Well, we know they're not. And they don't work in that way whatsoever. People that walk around ghost hunters with meters, they're looking for electromagnetic oddities. Meaning, is there something here that's odd that may attract spirits? Not that they are that way. So, does he believe that Set, the entity, is electromagnetic in nature, that it is a frequency, and all the other gods and goddesses that he likes to call upon? And again, we don't know much about what he's doing. He's not really stating any system here. Now, I assume his book on the Temple of Set, he's going to go into some magical practices. The problem is none of these Setians release anything that is practical in nature. The person who said that who restated that everything I know is in my books, well, he don't know much, and I don't think he ever did. I mean, he spent most of his time playing at the Magic Castle doing theatrical magic, and the reason he did that is because it's very impressive. You can trick people, and they will assume that you have an occult power. Now, you can't do that with occultism. You can't do rituals and so forth that are going to affect people instantly. They have long-term effects on people as energies weave in and out and cause whatever you've projected at them, but they're not impressive, and it never has been. But to think that he never researched psychic power, remote viewing, looked at all the researchers there, and could have access to, I'm assuming, files that nobody else could, meaning he can go into the remote viewing files that haven't been released and look at them. And of course, there's a mountain of research that on remote viewing that has been released in recent years. I believe it's all online, 50,000 pages or something ridiculous. Open to the public if you want to spend hours and hours reading through it to find what? To find military men? Oh yeah, talk about psychic powers, yeah. I shot it with a gun. I blew it up. Me military man. So the whole idea is that all of these things that go with that is, this was a problem with this guy. And I now remember when I was researching him 6-7 years ago, starting to read his stuff, I ran into the same problem. His horrible books, his lack of information, his constant quoting of other people. I don't have an original thought. Remember what Newton said? Plato, he was smart. I'm kind of stupid. So let's take that set. Okay, we know you can't think. You have to quote other people. Now, quoting people that say some sound bites that are profound is something that is appropriate in certain situations. And again, people mostly misquote people. The famous Nietzsche quote, what does not kill you makes you stronger, is not the correct statement. It's similar to that, but not. And all of these things are changed by society, just like the writing of the famous goofball Einstein, my feet hurt. The didn't write MC square, whatever it is, as we see it today. He wrote something else. And it was funny to see a top physicist, Brian Greene, show his original stuff and then say, gee, I don't know what the hell this means. This must be some old German stuff. No, he wrote it wrong, Brian. Everyone knows that Einstein was a boob. So it's as simple as that. He didn't understand mathematics. He had to get help with it. Now, there's certainly interesting things there. So I don't want to necessarily call him a boob, but he certainly was not the sharpest knife in the bunch. So as we go with all that, we have to understand these types of things. So he's still on that. This is his thing. For anybody who wonders about this guy. So I don't know how you can practice the things that he's doing. But of course, he did a lot of theatrical magic. So, I'm sure he would tell you how much power he had by producing a little toy. He was also a big fantasist. I just heard from another person who said they saw Aquino at San Francisco Wharf. And he had on a Dracula uniform or whatever it was there. He loved that. He copied Dark Shadows. That's what his haircut is about. He wears these black goofball vampire-looking things. Certainly, that ain't very Egyptian. And while his wife used to wear some Egyptian stuff, I never saw him with that. He all had this black uniform on, which looks just like a priest. So, and he doesn't seem to really have any kind of, very typical of Satanists. They have no imagination. They can't invent anything. They can't find anything new. It's all about them researching and copying. And that's very typical of these kind of people. So there's really nothing to talk about with this. If you want a great book to read when you want to go to sleep at night, it's so boring and so bizarre. And as I said, you can see from what I read to you how poorly written it is. If you're trying to get complicated ideas over to a person, you have to use common language that triggers in their mind so they understand what you're teaching them. And you certainly don't use ridiculously obtruse words to confuse the audience. It just doesn't make sense. I've been educating people for 40 years now. I know what it takes. And secondly, I have a terrible learning disability myself. So I have to figure out how to put things in a way that I personally can learn it, which has to be at a level that is understandable by all. As one thing that almost everybody tells me is that they understand what I'm telling them and I explain things directly and precisely and they get it. And this guy, God forbid what this guy did. Well, a typical military. Blow it up. So the whole idea is that we get into all these kind of But here's the kicker of this, and this is why I always like to. This is what you get in research. For all those people trying to figure out what research is about, when you're researching a subject, you're looking for inconsistencies and oddities or information that somebody hasn't put somewhere else. This is how you figure out. So if you listen to 10 interviews with a person, they're going to say 98% the same thing. But then they add to it. And I get this all the time. Aquino's done this. He originally, in his first radio interview, said that the entire thing was the 9/11 was a false flag. And he stated the CIA and Mossad, this was a false flag. His second interview, he stated CIA, FBI, Mossad, and the fact that these planes did not hit the building and they were taken to a military base, disassembled, and all the passengers were murdered. That's quite a little addition, isn't it? But that's what you're looking for. The other thing is, what else do they write? Just like we've confirmed now by his word that he almost died of cancer in 2015 or 16. I'm trying to remember now. I think it was 15. 1 year doesn't matter one way or another. But he wrote that in the book. Now, this comes from his mouth and his thinking. So it isn't someone else's misinterpretation. But here's the kicker again. Did he lie? Well, we don't know. Just because he said it out of his mouth doesn't at all mean it's true. Or that he's written it. There's some guys out there that are interview people and read their books and think, well, this is the word of God. Well, why would it be? Why would they be so smart? Why would they be a whistleblower? One of the reasons is that the people in control want both sides of the story told so they don't have any sneak thieves. They want to know whose their opposition is and they will support it, fund it, and publish their books. They want you to know. Part of it is the way of terrorizing people and have them fearful of police and government. They want you to know this stuff. Attila the Hun used to do this, sending people ahead saying, I just came back from the last village and they killed everybody and cut them up and burned them alive. And a lot of villages would surrender. So they want to do that. So you got to remember that when you get into any kind of classified or information, excuse me, that is something that you think they don't want you to get out is not true. Prime example of this is Bob Lazar. This is the guy who claimed he worked on spacecrafts, etc. Now, they want the public to know indirectly that we have contact with aliens and advanced technologies from their spacecrafts. But they don't want people who have any credibility. Now, Michael Aquino really doesn't have any credibility because of his dirty record and his accusations. The bottom line is that no matter what he does, you're that creep at the Presidio who molested children, whether it's real or not. He's a good guy to let things go out of. Bob Lazar's another one. Here's a guy with a strange background. Really doesn't appear to have a high-level education. He says he went to MIT, and then he talks about a teacher he had at Pierce City College, a junior college in the San Fernando Valley. And he said, Paul Schmidt there. No, he wasn't at MIT. He was a junior college teacher. He also was involved in, while living in Nevada, involved in some prostitution business. Well, good for him. But the point is that gives him lack of credibility. So they're going to release through him because they can say, you believe that stuff from that guy? That guy was in the whore business? A guy went to a junior college? You got to be kidding me. That's what they want. But other people listen to it and say, but isn't that an interesting story? Yeah, well, maybe. But there's a lot of question. So that's how it works, because both sides are paid off by the people that are in control. You can't be Bob Lazar and give out secrets and not get thrown in the pokey, killed, etc. It doesn't make sense. So why is he allowed to do this? Because they want him to do it. Now, and of course, he has no credibility. He's not a top scientist or anything else. He's a nobody. So what is the other thing here that's quite fascinating is that Aquino has decided to tell you who killed John F. Kennedy. That's pretty, if you think about it, that's pretty, I'm trying to find the exact area here so I can read it to you, but it's amazing how many people have claimed they've murdered JFK. The mafia, I just heard a mafia guy, and he said that he was a big guy in the mafia, all of these things 20, 30 years ago. And the mafia told him they killed JFK. So it's always somebody wants to take credit for this for whatever reason. And there may have been a lot of people involved. We just don't know. So that was always the thought. The CIA did it. Johnson did it. Everybody hated Kennedy to a large degree. But everybody wants to take credit for it as this something special. And of course, there's no way to prove it so you can't get into trouble because, of course, murder is not something that you can ever get away from. It's a crime until you're gone. So there's no, I forget the term now. There isn't where. Like most other things that, after 7 or 10 years, it's no longer enforceable. Murder is always enforceable. Oh, the statute of limitation is what I was talking about. So murder never does. But you're not going to track anybody. You're not going to find anybody. And of course, they find somebody, they pin the crime on them, and then that's it. The case is closed. That's the whole idea. These people are just dupes. They're put up, they're not going to trust them to do a job. And secondly, they just can't go out and assassinate somebody and not pin it on somebody. So they have to have somebody they pin it on and do that, like they did with 9/11 and everything else. Total fraudulent. I mean, that case is so amusing, it isn't even funny. They even found passports of the people who committed the so-called hijacks. They were on the sidewalks. They survived that. They had people on the sidewalks that were actors that said they saw things. I mean, it stinks to high heaven, and that's the way it all goes. So he names here, and I'm going to try and find it here, of who actually killed John F. Kennedy. And now they're saying that it was the military that worked in it. Now, could this be a CIA military people? Did they actually But he says who was in charge of it. Now, we don't know, without going into details, exactly did this also have to do with the stage that they put up there with the shooter and everything else, and they were involved in following it or not. And he got this information in a written letter from a high-ranking military officer. So let me see if I can find it here. Okay, so here's the scoop, and we'll close up this review here. He also talks about Oliver Stone's movie, JFK. And here's what he says, and I'll read it directly here. The unidentified Officer X in Stone's JFK was, in fact, Colonel L. Fletcher Prouty, U.S. Air Force retired, a close friend of the author, meaning Aquino, who had served as the Chief of Special Operations for the Joint Chiefs of Staff during the Kennedy administration. In a July 2nd, 1995 letter to the author, meaning Aquino, Prouty identified his immediate superior. Now, this is in a letter he wrote this. And Prouty was a lieutenant colonel, or colonel, actually. So he identified, so this was in a letter to Aquino that Prouty identified his immediate superior, Major General Edwards Lansdowne, as the architect and executor of the assassination. He had hundreds of trained and skilled men from Operation Mongoose whom he could use to flesh out the cover story that the true decision makers had to have to protect the real hit team, and created the 3 decades of cover story that has embarrassed American citizens since that date. See how badly he writes? Without such a cover story, the murder and resultant coup d'etat could not have been achieved so effectively. JFK would not give him that South Vietnamese ambassadorship, which he would have killed for. What else could he do? So I'm assuming that's another bad writing and some sarcasm there. Certainly that wasn't the reason to kill JFK. He killed JFK because he wanted to become an ambassador, this guy. That doesn't even make sense. But there's a complicated issue of what was going on there, and here's just another issue. So this guy, Michael Aquino, states that the assassination of John F. Kennedy was engineered and put together by General Edward Lansdowne. He was the architect and executor of the assassination. And he had plenty of men and everything else there. Of course, you have to wonder what kind of people, but, that's the military again. You have to wonder what kind of people would participate in the assassination of the commander-in-chief. Now, is this real? Now, he claims he have this letter, and of course, putting that in print would be dangerous, I guess. But, that's the kind of stuff you have to do. He states it here, but there's no proof of it. Just like there's no proof of anything he says, period. And I've caught him in several misinterpretations, the whitewashing things. He does this all the time when it comes to something that is not pretty, as well as his association with Heinrich Himmler in terms of the research there, kind of painting him as some sort of pagan leader, just another officer. Well, this is not true at all. These are people that do horrible atrocities. And stating that a few people died refurbishing his castle. No, 13,000 people died. This is a matter of record. And he built a concentration camp next to his castle, so he'd had endless workers to fix that Wievelburg castle. So all the things, and of course, he states differently to try and lessen the effect unless you do your own research. And here again, when you know a subject matter, this is when you find the liar. You find the incompetent. You find the boobs. This is when you know something, because they're going to misstate something that is commonly known or commonly part of whatever you do. And this is why it's so important to know your subject matter. You can tell if you're a baker and someone tells you to put in ridiculous ingredients that you would never put in as a baker, well, he's obviously not a baker. And obviously that recipe wouldn't work. So you have to say, well, what kind of credibility is this guy? He doesn't know how to make a cookie. Now he's going to write a cookbook? Well, all these things don't make any sense. So, like with everybody's writings, we don't know if they're true or not. If someone goes on a talk show and states whatever doesn't mean that they're telling you the truth. So that's another thing people, well, I get it from the horse's mouth. Reading something from a legal document. You can put anything you want in a legal document. I don't think there's, in the United States, I don't think there's any type of a law against that. So if you want to state someone has this, well, has done something, you just go ahead and do it. And I've seen this from many celebrities. I believe, I don't know who was Jim Carrey's the comic actor. So I don't know who it was that he was getting a divorce or had papers run. And she just had this litany of things. He was violent. He did this. He gave her a venereal disease. All the things there. These are pretty nasty stuff. This is horrible slander. But they put these in these documents all the time, and they threaten to bring out more of it, which will be public record. That's another way of them getting money. But the point is it correct? Well, we don't know. This happened with Johnny Depp as well, claiming him to be a drunken, violent person when there was pictures of her assaulting him. So the whole idea is that we just don't know what the truth is, and if someone states something, it doesn't mean it's the truth in any way whatsoever. Can it be proven? And it could be the truth, but it can't be proven. This is all part of trying to investigate somebody and figure out what it is. Just because it's a legal document means nothing. Just because his chauffeur told you that, his pilot, the guy who worked for him for 20 years, all this stuff is meaningless. Because if you really were loyal, you wouldn't say anything. And if you didn't like the person, well, what do you care? You'll say anything you want. Especially if it gets you cash. And that's what gets you cash. If you want to sell your story to the National Enquirer and other places, well, you're going to have a pretty exciting story. And you're going to have to be able to prove it to a large degree. So all of these things we have to look at in the bigger picture. What's going on here? What is this all about? If someone says something, is it true? And of course, from his understanding, that's what happened with 9/11, meaning those planes. Now, it certainly does make sense. It fits the scenario. And I've heard this before, by the way. The planes never looked real hitting those buildings. Anyway, they always looked strange. And the kind of entry into the buildings and everything else didn't look to make sense whatsoever. It certainly should have come out the other side, and very little came out the other side. So all of these things, when you look at those, and of course we have a perfect picture of it at a perfect angle, how convenient. And all the other things that happen there. So, but is it what makes sense that that's what be happen? I've heard that before, that these planes were, because there was no wreckage of planes really found anywhere. Certainly there was none at the Pentagon. That was a missile attack. The one that was the heroes on there who slammed the plane into the ground. There was no plane parts anywhere. I guess the Pentagon didn't want to pay for those very expensive airplane engines to smash them into the ground and do whatever there. That would be a very difficult thing to do, and it would be very dangerous for anybody on that who would crash a plane like that. So the whole idea is that all this doesn't make sense and so forth. So now we have this Lansdale person is supposedly the retired Air Force now, but that military engineered and executed the coup d'etat that happened, because that was a whole new policy came in. Kennedy had his own way of doing things and wanted to get out of Vietnam. He wanted to work more with the Russians. He wanted to, there's so many things he wanted to do towards the end of his actual administration there, which was really against the military-industrial complex. They didn't want any of that. They wanted to continue in Vietnam. Now, he committed us to Vietnam. So, Kennedy's a strange person, and so is that entire Kennedy family, which seems to be working for the struggling lower classes, and yet they are super rich people and have treated people terribly, particularly women. So the whole idea is that, again, they're just strange. Of how they operate and what they're doing, and there was a lot of people that hated them, as well as the mafia and everything else, which basically brought Kennedy the election by rigging votes. Does that sound familiar? And then, of course, Kennedy betrayed the mafia. Supposedly, Frank Sinatra got them a certain district vote that gave him the needed electoral votes that he would win. I forget who he was running against. Was it Nixon then? But the whole idea is that he could win that. So it was, again, they won by illegal methods. They fixed the election. So that's what went on there. And of course, this is what brought the ire up of the mafia. And while they've always thought to have killed him, and I always thought that that was pretty much the scenario anyway, that this was done that way. But it's a very complicated operation here that seems to go way above the mafia, which is basically just, if you want somebody killed, well, yeah, that's something easily done. But if you want to have a fall guy, if you want to set something up, which they did with all these fake things, shooting from this book depository, whatever the heck it was up there, all this stuff is a very complicated plan, which I think is way beyond the actual mafia. And it's going to take a lot of local people and a lot of local corruption, and higher up corruption in the federal government for you to do something like that. So that's the kind of interesting, fun story. That's the only thing this book has in it that's interesting and different to find out. Another page or book of notes we can put on the JFK assassination for those that find that interesting and want to look up that information further. But in general, this is another gobbledygook book saying a bunch of nothing, thinking he's got some psyops plan to control the world so nobody kills each other in wars. Certainly that hasn't worked. I don't think any of what he puts has ever been applied anyway, but this book was written at a time when there were wars going on and have been going on and new wars started. Nobody is applying these kind of principles, and nobody does that. Nobody uses free energy. Nobody uses the free cures out there. Everybody is doing their own self-destructive evil purpose and not following along anything that would make sense. So, while some of his stuff here is interesting, as I said, I think it's just gobbledygook. Nothing practical whatsoever, people. There certainly isn't any psychic techniques. There isn't anything in here whatsoever. There are no magic techniques. There are absolutely nothing. Now, some of his other books are more magical, the ones on the Temple of Set, but these are pretty dry, boring stuff as well, where he endlessly quotes other people, which I could care less about because he doesn't really have any of his own opinions or can deduct anything at a high level. So here we go again with someone who has an appearance of this, and because he's been an officer, he gets away with just basically barfing out information of little value, but who's going to contradict him? Well, nobody's going to contradict him. That's how the military is. The military works by rank, and nobody does anything in rank to contradict someone else. So he barfs out this kind of nonsense based on nothing. Oddly enough, he likes to criticize, but of course, Einstein and his basic philosophies, which I do as well, but he never misses to take a jab at the Jews because he's a Nazi and worships those people and always has. He's got some really serious problems, and there's some connections there with Mommy and everything else, who during the height of Hitlerism in the middle 30s, she was in Berlin carving away at statues, apparently, learning there. Seems to me that something is going on there that he's not talking about either. So there's all sorts of things here, and as I said, I'm going to slowly go through the rest of his books, but it's going to be a while before I do that. I'm taking a break from his stuff. He gives me a headache with his gobbledygook writing, trying to sound sophisticated, when all it really sounds like is gobbledygook. Until next time.